Hi everyone, I'm Sayel Filias, the Program's Learning and Development Specialist at CEREC. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm coming to you live from Canada, and I know that we have international attendees with us today, including many Americans. So welcome everyone. We are always thrilled to have a global audience with us, so thank you for your participation. I also want to say, and especially because we're here from different countries, that CEREC continues to monitor the situation and especially the evolving impact on the career development community. So we want to share our thoughts for our colleagues impacted everywhere in the world right now. We know that there is a lot of uncertainty, and we do appreciate you take the time to be together today. And we'll continue as much as we can to provide you with remote learning opportunities like this webinar series. And today we are delighted to have David Blustein with us live from Boston, US, who will talk about his psychology working theories, published in a CEREC book called Career Theories and Model at Work. But before David gets started, we would like to take a few moments to introduce you to CEREC, for those of you who don't know us yet, and share some housekeeping notes with you. CEREC is a charitable organization that focuses on education and research in career counseling and career development in Canada. We found the development of resources like the Career Theories and Model at Work book in order to advance knowledge in the field. And bringing you learning opportunities like this free webinar series is also a key part of our mandate. We also have three main programs: the careerwise.ca website, which features the top news and view in the field, with a French version called orientation.ca, the Canadian Journal of Career Development, which is free to access, and the Connexus National Career Development Conference held in Ottawa each January, and for which we recently launched the call for presenter for Connexus 21. You can learn more about all of the CEREC work and resources at cerec.ca. Also, because the CEREC is always keen to learn how we can best support the career development community with learning opportunity, you will have a short survey at the end of today's webinar to share with us what your learning needs are right now. So thank you in advance for your answer. Now, some housekeeping note with you. If during today's webinar you have any questions or any comments, you can enter them in the question box you see on your screen. As usual, we will have a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar with David, and we will address the questions. Now, be reassured that next week you will receive a follow-up email from us with all the materials, including the video of today's webinar and the one from John Wooden last week. Now, I'm happy to say that we have Roberta Note live with us today. Roberta is one of the three co-editors of the Career Theories and Model at Work book. And without the tremendous work of our editors, Nancy Authors, Mary McMahon, and Roberta, the book will not have been brought to life. And also, because we are here an international audience today, we are happy to let you know that CEREC has just announced that we will be publishing a French translation of the book, due to be out in January of next year. So we are delighted to have Roberta Note with us today to say a few words about the book and introduce our presenter. So over to you, Roberta.
It is such an exciting time to be here with you. And the idea for this book actually was inspired many years ago. In 2011, I was the editor of the Journal of Employment Counseling, and we did a Thoughts on Theory special issue and just reached out to several colleagues and asked if they'd write a really brief 3-page description of their theory. And out of that, we started to do some conference presentations with whoever, whichever authors happened to be nearby locally. And Nancy and Mary and I thought, wouldn't it be lovely to have a book that reached out to these people and let them, in their own voices, tell us a little bit about their theory, but more than that, bring it to life through vignettes, through practical examples, to show us how they would work with their own theory. And we reached out to the top people in the world, and people like David said, yeah. And we ended up with a book with 43 chapters that are the voices of the people who have done the thinking about career development in different contexts around the world. And I was just saying to David before the webinar began today that his his work has been made for this context. And so I personally can't wait to hear what he says as he's contextualized it for us in the midst of COVID-19. Now, if we turn to the next slide, you'll see a little bit about David. He is really world renowned for his work. He's based in Massachusetts, which right now is a hot spot for COVID. So we're just really praying for his safety. And his work has influenced me in Canada. I know it's influenced the work that I've done in Indonesia and in China and various other places. It is very social justice rooted, and so I've met David personally over the years and always known him to be unbelievably humble, but also incredibly compassionate. And David is truly one of the most brilliant people I've ever talked to in this field. So I am thrilled to have him here doing a webinar for us today. And I'm going to sit back and learn along with the rest of you right now. Thanks for being here, David.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you, Sorel. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really have been looking forward to this for quite a long time. So let me just get my slides set up. Okay, so it's great to be here. I planned to do this 4 or 5 months ago, and obviously a lot's happened since then, and I have thought a lot about how I was going to do this presentation, and I've decided to embed it in this COVID-19 crisis and to also embed it in the Canadian context. So I want to, first of all, say how I'm so thrilled to be involved with CERIC and so excited to be part of this book, and how I also want to underscore how much I've admired the Canadian career development community. It's been an extraordinary community, much more impactful than the size of the country would suggest. And CERIC in particular is an organization that I'm really impressed with and does wonderful work, and a sister organization to ours in the US, the National Career Development Association. So here's my agenda for today, to talk about psychology of working theory, which we abbreviate into PWT, related to the COVID-19 crisis. And I'm going to talk specifically about practice and systemic interventions, and I will definitely have time for about 10 minutes of questions. So I'm very excited to be here, and here we go. So what happened to us 2 months ago is we got caught up in a huge pandemic, and for a different presentation, for a different time, we could talk about what went wrong in the public health community to not really contain this, although many countries are containing it. Sadly, I'm not only in a country that's struggling with it, but I'm in a part of the United States, the Northeast, that is really struggling. And we anticipate we'll be on lockdown for at least another month or two, and I think that's the right thing to do. So the prevailing theme of the last 2 months is one of fear, loss, and grief. And in many ways, as I'll talk about it, this is a game-changing illness, and it's very much a game changer in terms of the impact on work and career. So the intervention that works at this point is physical distancing, and the consequences of physical distancing are loneliness, isolation, and sadly, a highly constricted economy, which has produced enormous unemployment, the likes of which none of us can remember in our lived experience, but certainly unemployment that has seems to be equal to what we've experienced during the Great Depression. This is going to be a major challenge for our profession, and it's one, as Roberta pointed out, that in some ways I've been preparing for this my whole life, and preparing for it in a way of trying to develop theories, ideas, practices, systemic intervention models that will work in trying to help the many people who are struggling. So here's the employment situation in Canada. I got this this figure from the internet, and this describes the job losses in Canada, and I think this was from mid-April. And it describes the over 1 year change in employment, and you could see that there's been an enormous amount of job loss in Canada. These are two stories, one from Reuters, that by April 9th, excuse me, Canada lost 1.01 million jobs as of the end of March. And in a report from April 15th, Global News indicated that Canada needed a New Deal type jobs program. The situation in the United States parallels the experience in Canada and across the world as countries are devastated economically in managing this crisis. So this has been my thinking about work in the COVID era, that in many ways, this crisis has really unearthed and put into bolder relief the impact of inequality in our workforces. And now we have a situation with large numbers of unemployed people. I call it a multifaceted nature of work. We also have essential workers who are working in the storm of the virus. And then we have the ones who get the most attention in the media, people working from home, which often is taking place with blurred boundaries. And while I'm one of those very fortunate people to work at home and still be able to earn my salary, and we're very, very fortunate for that, we need to look at the rest of our community and of our members of our societies, some of whom have lost their jobs. And in our country, in the US, where we have a very, very porous safety net, we are seeing people who are hungry already. Many of you in Canada and around the world may have seen on the news miles long, kilometer long, many kilometers of cars lined up at the American food banks. And it breaks my heart to see it. And it really speaks to a real fundamental problem in the American culture and American economy. The crisis has provided us with an opportunity and an obligation, in my view, to rethink how we work. And that's going to be one of the ways that I move forward in the coming months and years. So why develop a different theory and paradigm? This theory actually emerged almost 20 years ago. And it came out of my own life, my own work experience, my own experience doing career counseling. I'm also a psychologist and I've done therapy for many decades. So it comes out of this experience I have of working with people, sharing their lived experience, comes out of the life of my parents and their peers when I was growing up in New York. So I felt like that our studies of work and career needed to be very inclusive, that it needs to include the full range of work issues, including but not limited to career choice and development, which is the main focus of much of the work that career counselors do. We need to focus as well on systems as well as individuals. And as I have put this work forward with many colleagues, many of whom I will cite today, we really believe the psychology of working fits the criteria to be a theory of change. As a conceptual lens, in a book that I wrote in 2006, The Psychology of Working, I tried to map out a new framework, a new way of thinking about work and career. And I describe it here, the goals of this book, which really launched the Psychology of Working movement, which now has a global network and I think is making an impact in our community. And for me, doing these webinars gives me a chance to share my enthusiasm for this way of working and this way of thinking about work and social justice, and also both systemic and individual interventions. So here are the fundamental assumptions of psychology of working theory: that work is a central aspect of life and mental health. Psychological study of working should include everyone who works and who wants to work. Work and non-work experiences are often seamlessly experienced in the natural course of people's lives. I have advocated for an experience near understanding of the role of work in people's lives. I feel strongly that that we need to really focus on people's lived experiences. And this perspective, this theory, is very much focused on identifying, also trying to mitigate social, economic, and political forces that affect and influence the distribution of resources in our societies, which clearly affect our capacity to develop lives of meaning, purpose, and sustainability in our work. The final assumptions are that working occurs in various contexts, including the marketplace as well as caregiving context. In this context, I am affirming the work of one of my mentors, Mary Sue Richardson, who has done a tremendous amount of work on looking at caregiving and market-based work, and has also done some of the earliest work in advocating for a focus on work as a more inclusive way of understanding people's work lives. And her article in 1993 in the Journal of Counseling Psychology had a profound influence for me, and as I always cite her work in presentations like this as a major influence. Psychology of working also embeds conceptualizations of work in cultural and relational contexts. And I also have the view that psychology of working is not meant to replace existing theories. I don't have that kind of view that in order to be a highly functional career practitioner, you need to just use one theory. I think people need to use multiple theories. And as you will see, as when I present this, there's room for people to use career construction theory. There's room for people to use social cognitive career theory, to use a wide range of theories, many of which are summarized so beautifully in the new book that has been edited by our SARA colleagues. I also have argued that working has the potential to fulfill core human needs and promote well-being. And with that as a hook, I will now present to you the fundamental needs that working can fulfill optimally in our lives. Here, I'm showing you the cover of the 2013 edited book that I worked on for Oxford University Press. And this edited book was an opportunity to put together scholars from around the world to really apply psychology of working ideas across the range of issues to organizations, to the world of career counseling, psychotherapy, public policy, etc. So the main fundamental needs that I talk about are the needs for survival and power, needs for relatedness and social contribution, and needs for self-determination. So let's talk first about the need for self-determination and power. You'll see I try to come up with interesting photos for these slides. Sometimes the photos may have nothing to do with the slide, but I thought they were just beautiful, very peaceful. Maybe this one reminds me of how hard I would find it to survive in the open wild. So work provides people at a fundamental level with a way of obtaining the necessary goods and services that we need to survive. Apropos of what I mentioned earlier of people in the US who are struggling to keep a roof over their heads, to keep food on the table, we could see how critical work is to sustainability. And this whole need hierarchy does build on the work of Abraham Maslow, excuse me, the highly influential humanistic psychologist from the mid-20th century. In order to really think about the way in which need for survival and power functions, it's useful to look at the evolutionary history of our work. Excuse me, work is essential for human survival. In many ways, as I've studied the anthropology of work, people developed this concept of work out of our activities focused on survival. The very first human period is known as the hunter-gatherer period, describing the two of the most important jobs, if you will, of that era. Then that led to, as societies began to develop, to an agricultural lifestyle, and then it led to the Industrial Revolution and into the subsequent revolutions we're experiencing now. With the notion of land ownership came the acquisition of economic and social power. And throughout my work, I do concern myself with this issue of power. Who has the power to control access to resources? And in addition, the role of work in helping people to become more powerful and more agentic in their lives. You'll see this issue coming up a little bit later in the presentation. The next need is the need for social connection. And this is based on what many of us call the relational revolution in counseling. in career development and in the social sciences. So this function focuses on the role of work in providing people with a means of social connection. So, and I think a lot of us who are now working remotely are experiencing this. In some ways, we experience these needs most prominently when they're not fulfilled. And I could speak for myself that I'm very lucky to have my wife home now, and it's been an amazing, wonderful time we've had. At the same time, I do miss social interactions with people at work. And often they could just be short little interchanges. Sometimes they're long, sustained, very meaningful friendships. But these kinds of interchanges are really important in our lives. And again, I think we all see the loss of them. In seeing the loss, we could see what we've had and what we lost. This work builds on the research literature in psychology on the role of relationships in our lives, that we are fundamentally hardwired to strive for close connections. Another aspect of the relatedness need is the need for social contribution. And this is this notion that we are, by working, we're also connected to the broader social world. And this is a fundamentally important aspect of our lives, which is the capacity to feel like we're contributing to something bigger than ourselves. And this doesn't always happen in jobs that necessarily are fundamentally critical to the welfare of society. Although right now what we're seeing is we're much more aware in this crisis of the fundamentally important role that every worker plays in our society. And I feel in some ways one of the positive outcomes of this is the way that we have really understood that dignity at work is a fundamentally critical aspect of our lives, and that there's dignity in all work, and that part of dignity comes from the internal experience of feeling it, but also comes from the external world of people affirming it and validating it. And I think this is one of the positive outcomes, is for our ability to really treasure the essential workers, the grocery store workers, the people who are delivering packages to our homes, the medical workers, all allowing us to survive. I also consider caregiving to be a fundamental aspect of the psychology of working, and I've written about it in all of my books. Caregiving could include taking care of children, taking care of sick or disabled family members, and also taking care of the elderly. So it's a critical aspect of the psychology of working. The third need is the need for self-determination. And this need is actually based on a self-determination theory perspective from motivational psychology. And it's based on the notion that people are most optimally motivated when they're in situations that they're engaged in activities that feel authentic and that feel meaningful to them. Clearly, we can't always be engaged in activities that are meaningful to us. So this theory has actually outlined a way for us to find extrinsically motivating activities to be to contribute to our sense of self-determination. In the psychology of working theory, self-determination is the part of the theory that looks at people it looks at the way in which people can engage in work that helps them create a life of purpose and meaning, and a life that's fulfilling in relation to their identities. So this is where the traditional career development discourse is located in the psychology of working theory. The supportive conditions for self-determination include competence, relatedness, and autonomy. According to the theorists, whose names are DC and Ryan, they argue that people are most likely to be able to engage in self-determination in their tasks and activities when they feel some sense of competence, here again a sense of relatedness, and a sense of autonomy. I was very interested in the self-determination theory, and have remained this way, very interested in it, because I think it provides us with a way to help people who are in jobs that may not be intrinsically interesting. It may provide a way to help them find meaning and purpose in their work. because these conditions that I have on the slide now are fundamentally important for people as they consider ways of trying to internalize a more motivational approach in jobs that may not be that interesting. In relation to this COVID-19 crisis and the career tasks that we have as practitioners, career counselors and coaches, we're going to be faced with people who are going to need to take jobs just to pay the bills. And this is going to be a very complex kind of situation, which is why using these needs, I think, could be very useful to us during this time period. So as I mentioned, self-determination is consistent with the tradition of most career choice and development models. There is a continuum of motivational states going from intrinsic to extrinsic to amotivation. Some of us may be struggling with this amotivation during this lockdown. It is hard to stay motivated all day long. As I mentioned, the conditions that support self-determination provide some really good ideas for us in how to promote meaningful and purposeful work, even in situations where that's not necessarily available to people in a given job. So let me transition now to this notion of psychology of working as a theory of change. And this moves to a fourth major publication. There's been many publications in the psychology of working, including a major theoretical paper from 2016 that was authored by Ryan Duffy, who was actually the first author on that paper, as well as Matt Deemer and Kelsey Auden. And I'm focusing more on the practice aspect of PWT in this presentation. But trust me, there's a tremendous amount of research on this theory right now, and it is outlined in some new chapters we've written, which I'm happy to follow up with people on if they're interested. So in an article that we've written for the Career Development Quarterly, the NCDA journal, just came out in the summer of 2019, we developed this notion of the psychology of working as the theory of change. And here I want to talk a little bit about what a theory of change means. In most of the social sciences, theories function as a way to predict and explain phenomenon. And a lot of us are very interested in theories in our work. We're also interested in the theories about why the coronavirus is so deadly. We're really focused a lot on the role of theory in our lives. It's a fundamental aspect of, being an engaged citizen right now. So some theories focus primarily on prediction and explanation. Some theories focus on prediction and explanation and on creating knowledge that will help to create change in individuals and systems. Many career development theories are theories of change. I'm not trying to suggest that PWT is necessarily different. We have really internalized and owned this aspect of who we are. And as you'll see in the next few slides, we've come up with a parallel intervention model for both individuals and systems. So in this slide, I'm providing the reference for this article, this Career Development Quarterly article. And for those of you who are members of NCDA, you can get this article for free. For those who are not, feel free to write to me or to connect to me through ResearchGate. And you could request the article through ResearchGate as well, or directly through me. But I felt it was a really good summary article for the world of career practice in this era. So we propose that PWT fits perfectly into the theory of change context. PWT seeks to create change, knowledge, and practices that will identify the overt and covert predictors and outcomes of a wide range of work-related issues. And I'm going to go over this in some detail in the remaining part of this webinar. So we developed a model of psychology of working counseling. And here we talked about how existing practices have not really adequately addressed the needs of the poor and marginalized clients. Psychology of working is also focused a lot on clients who do not have much volition in their decisions. However, it's important to note that PwC focuses on the full breadth of issues that pertain to work, including the traditional career choice and development purview or agenda of most career practitioners in the Western world. So PWT is often mistakenly viewed as a perspective that is primarily constructed for people on the margins. It is particularly focused on this population because my view is most people around the globe are on the margins, and most people around the globe do not have access to the grand career narrative. However, PWT has a tremendous amount of implication for traditional career counseling, as you will see in the following part of the presentation. So what we've developed here is a multifaceted change paradigm where there's two phases of the intervention strategy and two domains. So what's relevant here is we have a focus on individual interventions as well as group interventions that would come out of the traditional world of career practice. And then we have a focus on systemic interventions. So the goals of the needs assessment are that we use the needs taxonomy from PWT to try to organize the assessment and intervention planning. So those three needs I went over earlier, we've mapped them out on this table. This table is found in the article. You'll also have the slides, so you can certainly consult with this table on these slides. You can see we use the three major need categories, and in this table, we described examples of assessing people's needs, the capacity that they have to fulfill their needs. So certainly during this COVID-19 era, this issue of survival is going to come up a lot. And then we also look at systemic implications. And in this context, we argue that we need to look at the way in which systems support sustainable lives. We also look at social connection as a major need, and we provide examples here. Then we also include self-determination as a major set of needs. In terms of the change tools, here we go back to this notion of agency, of being active and actively engaged. This is where you might find some of the traditional career counseling interventions, but we are also looking at agentic action from a broader macro level perspective. The psychology of working theory, while it does have psychology in its title, is really a multidisciplinary theory that builds explicitly on sociology, economics, anthropology, the full range of social sciences. So the role of macro level factors in our model is essential. We focus on economic constraints and marginalization. And we've developed out of these macro level factors and an understanding as well of the psychological factors in becoming agentic, in trying to develop the impetus to make changes, we've developed three integrative clusters. So here's the table that looks at these clusters. The first one is proactive engagement, and these are the defining elements. Being proactive, career adaptability would be part of proactive engagement, career planning, career exploration, and we give systemic examples and individual examples. The next one is critical reflection and action, which is really important. And that's based on this notion that there's a great advantage to developing critical consciousness, of becoming aware of the broad systemic issues that are taking place in the world and understanding how these issues affect individuals and systems. And then we focus as well on social support and community engagement and the importance of relational support. So these three clusters of agentic action are really, really important. So let me give you an example of how to use these particular sources of agentic action in relation to the challenge of unemployment. So in returning to this challenge, and a lot of us are facing this already, in terms of working with clients, we can look at a number of different tools, helping people to become active, engage in becoming more behaviorally active, doing exercise, helping them to engage in structured job search, which is a very important way of becoming activated, identifying transferable skills, learn what the world needs, and exploration and planning, and there's much, much more. The full range of working with the unemployed would fall under, of the interventions for working with the unemployed would fall under the rubric of proactive engagement. critical reflection and action is particularly important in this unemployment context, because there's some really important research that indicates that a lot of people become depressed when they're unemployed. There's a very strong correlation between mental health problems and unemployment. And part of that is due to the fact that people often blame themselves. The work of Paulo Freire, who has done brilliant work on developing this notion of critical consciousness, helps us to understand that people need to kind of become much more critically aware of the social context and the political context. As they do, we know from a lot of research, some of it done by a former student of mine, Matt Deemer, we know that people who understand the social roots of their situation are much more likely to develop protective factors to ward off despair, and also more likely to engage in advocacy for themselves and others, more likely to initiate career development behaviors as well. Then finally, the social support and community engagement aspect focuses on networking, which is clearly an important aspect of managing unemployment. But as we all know, as practitioners and as people who live in the world, during times of distress, we need relationships even more than ever. So one of the things that career practitioners do, and that I've done in my work, is to help people deepen their relationships, and where possible, develop new relationships. In addition, community engagement is very, very important during this period, and we need to help connect our clients to counselors, to people within community-based career centers, and to seek support from institutions, faith-based institutions, community organizations, to try to develop the kind of relational support that is been decimated by this pandemic. So let me talk a little bit about creating change in systems. In my article, we give some different examples. We actually use the example of the International Labor Organization, which has been a big inspiration to me throughout the last 8 to 10 years of my writing and research career and advocacy career. Creating change in systems, in this case, I'm using using findings and an agenda that was the culmination of my most recent book, which came out last year, The Importance of Work in an Age of Uncertainty, which was published in July by Oxford University Press. So in this book, I did an in-depth qualitative study. We did interviews of 58 people from across the United States, and I also did a very in-depth review of the literature about the role of work in people's lives. And at the end of the book, I established an agenda for change, and that's what I want to do, to focus on systemic change. So the chapters of the book really define a broad array of ways in which work functions at its best to help us feel truly alive in the world. And I really do believe that work at its best can help us feel engaged. I'm not saying that everybody needs to work, or that there's not room for non-work activities in people's lives. That's not part of who I am as a person, or in my academic or professional role. But work in our society, it does provide a lot of our needs, not all of them. But these chapter titles give you a sense of what it means to be alive in the world, and how work can provide us with a way of engaging in this sense of aliveness. Some of these chapter titles come from the Psychology of Working Needs framework, and some of them are elaborations of the earlier work, like being part of something bigger than ourselves, being able to care. I've devoted a whole chapter to it. Being able to work without oppression and harassment. And then in that final chapter, I discussed work as a human birthright, and I came up with an agenda, a social justice-based systemic intervention for creating humane work. Well, before I get to that, let me just go over some of the most relevant conclusions from the book. One of them is that the psychological experiences of work are very emotionally intense, and that people were angry, scared, and anxious. In many ways, this book foreshadowed the rupture that people are feeling now. And When the book was published, the United States, the unemployment rate was very low. I think that was a misleading statistic, by the way. But the book unearthed the sense of vulnerability that people felt. And this was perhaps the most important finding, which became the subtitle of the book about the eroding work experience in America, that people began to talk about and report a sense that their sense of work in their lives, particularly people who worked for a few decades, that their work lives had deteriorated, had kind of eroded. And what I found in this book is that the erosion of work was mirrored by an internal sense of identity diffusion, of a sense of fragmentation, of a psychological sense of distress that I felt was a mirror experience of what people were experiencing externally in their lives. So here's some of the objectives that culminated that were reviewed in the final chapter of my book. Worker protections and unions need to be supported and sanctioned. I know Canada has a much stronger presence of unions than the United States does. And I really do hope that in our November election, we will see a change in administrations such that unions will be restored and that worker protections will be restored as well. A work-based safety net is needed for all. The countries that are managing this unemployment crisis, well, those that are doing it best are those that have provided resources for employers to keep many of their employees on the payroll. That hasn't happened so much in the US, and the result you could see is a tremendous crisis here. I also believe that our society can create sufficient jobs. As you can see, my last point is the governments need to regulate the neoliberal economy. I've been very explicit about this in my book and in my recent work that career practitioners do need to be involved in these political debates and dialogues. And we could see the downside of the neoliberal economy in the way that these crises have been handled. Infrastructure work is a short-term solution. Longer-term solutions to unemployment include, I believe, economically sanctioning caregiving work. There are some movements in the United States to do this, to provide people with some resources if they're taking care of an elderly or disabled family member who would ordinarily be in a care facility. We also need to create work based on fair tax policy and fair distribution of resources. And I do mention here that this idea that there will not be enough work, to me, is a misconception. There's more than enough work that needs to be done. We just need to find ways to pay for it. And I believe that we need to develop a planned approach to job creation that connects the public and private sectors. So the closing comments here is I'll have a little bit more time for some questions, which I'm looking forward to, is that the participants in my book were passionate and eloquent about their work lives. The reality of their lived experiences was much more brutal and harsh than what I had expected going into this project. And this project took about 6 years to work on. The erosion in the workplace was disconcerting, and it's causing major problems for people in communities. So some final comments. I do believe that psychology working theory and its related intervention strategies are needed now more than ever. Our field is facing a major crisis, and I feel very strongly that, like our society, the career development field is facing a crisis now as well, a crisis of our own meaning and purpose. Who are we? How are we going to intervene at this moment? In many ways, I believe this is one of the most challenging moments of our profession's history, not just our own individual lives. Our communities are faced with loss of life. The loss of life is going to create a sense of grief that is affecting, it's going to be pervasive in our communities. Loss of the illusion of health, loss of livelihoods, and the loss of social connections. And I think this is both a crisis for us, and it's an opportunity to reshape our field so that we can be responsive to all, which has been one of the goals of my personal life and my mission in life, which is to really help inform and invigorate the field of career development to be responsive to everyone. So on that note, I will close my presentation, and we have about 15 minutes for questions. So I believe Sorel is going to give me the questions, and looking forward to your input and feedback.
Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. It was really great. And you're right, it's now time for the questions. So you can still ask your question by typing on the chat function on your control panel. The first question actually for you, David, a lot of people were interested to learn more on how to get access to your books. So I guess we'll be happy to collaborate with you and maybe add the links to the follow-up email that we will send to attendees.
Yes, the books are easy to get. They're available in Amazon. I don't know if people are comfortable using Amazon outside the US. The most recent book is available from Oxford University Press. It's very easy to get, and it's not expensive at all. I will provide links for these books.
Awesome, and we will add that on the follow-up email. Okay, so let's start with questions. So I have the first one coming from Ed, asking, can you share another sentence or two about your position on applying the 3 elements of self-determination to survival jobs in order to support workers who might have to accept survival jobs during COVID?
So how we can help people accept these jobs?
And what will be your position on applying the 3 elements of self-determination to survival jobs?
Excellent point. So that's a great question. As people are faced with having to get survival jobs, we could look at those 3 elements of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And if they have options, to try to choose the job that provides access to those 3, or as many of those 3 elements as possible. It may not always be realistic to do this, but relatedness, for example, if they have to do a job that they don't really want to do, maybe try to find other people in their community to do it with them. The issues of autonomy are hard because when you're in a position of needing a job, it's hard to go in there and say, you need to give me autonomy, because right now the employers are in the driver's seat. And it's a big problem in our society that workers, it is hard when you get a job to go in and insist on certain conditions. But for career practitioners, we could use these elements, these 3 self-determination needs, to help people select options that are going to be maximally supportive of fulfilling those 3 needs.
Thank you, David. I have a question from Heather. In today's world of more workers having to take on 2-part jobs and lower opposed to for benefits, what is your thought on the impact of work moving more to contracting part-time job?
That we could start having more part-time jobs so that we could distribute work to more people. Is that it?
Yeah.
I think it's a good idea. I mean, I think we need, the labor market is going to need to be managed. The idea that it's going to be managed by the free market in a crisis like this is not going to work. I think in Canada you have a more progressive prime minister who does get that point. So yeah, I think there are times when, certainly at the beginning part of the reemployment process, where people will have to share work. In my university, people are talking about furloughs, reducing salaries. They're talking about reducing salaries for people who make, kind of having it be a progressive reduction of salary. I think that makes sense. Not going to be easy for people to absorb these, but the people who make more money should be able to absorb them better than people who make less. And I do think that redistributing work at the outset to get people back into the workplace would be very helpful.
Thank you, David. Let's take another question from Emil, asking, how would you apply these theories for high school students as they look toward post-secondary pathway and occupations?
It's a great question. I think this theory is very relevant to people at high school for the traditional career guidance part of our work. The three, looking at their career, first of all, helping them think about their career goals in terms of the degree to which they'll fulfill these human needs is an important complement to other kinds of considerations that high school youth will be mulling over, which is to what extent will my career path fulfill my interests and values. We could also add into that equation a capacity to meet your fundamental human needs. Embedded in psychology working theory, of course, is an open embrace of traditional career counseling models. So I think the theory could be particularly helpful in terms of helping people develop critical consciousness. I think it's important. I'm not trying to suggest that the career sessions be converted into political discussions. There's an art to facilitating career consciousness, of kind of gradually helping people to explore different kinds of systemic explanations for issues. There is a particularly strong protective factor that critical consciousness serves for high school students. And I reference the work of my colleague, Matt Deemer. I could provide the reference for that in follow-up as well. So I think elements of this PWT model are very relevant to high school students, and particularly during this period. We also have to instill hope in our high school youth as they see this kind of devastation all around them. And we're going to have to do a lot of work with our high school and post-secondary youth.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, absolutely. Feel free to share any material that you want us to share with attendees. We'll be happy to do so. Related to the previous question, Vera is asking, how do you think the pandemic will impact the labor market and job search for people? And how do career practitioners respond to the changes?
That's a great question. I have to say, we don't quite know. I mean, I read these articles in the New York Times, other outlets, trying to predict how the economy will be revitalized. And it's hard to say. I mean, some people think that, I think the COVID virus, in my view, won't really be over till we have a vaccine. I think that the people will be going back and the disease will subside, but it won't be entirely eradicated, and there'll be people who will still be reluctant to go back out there. And I think this is going to create a really difficult period, especially in the workforce, because people are going to be compelled to go back into work to earn a living. So I think that's going to be a particularly challenging period. Following that, when there's a vaccine, I do think that we could put this period behind us. The question will be, how will the whole economy change? And there's a lot of speculations, a lot of people writing columns about it, that organizations will push more toward artificial intelligence. People will want people to work from home more, and some of that may be in an increase in precarious work. To be honest, I don't think we can predict it at this point, but as practitioners, we should be prepared for the worst. Be prepared that this unemployment will go on longer than the COVID crisis will, and be prepared for a recession, kind of a global recession, and in some regions, an economic depression. Parts of the US now, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, these states have been devastated by the crisis, have lost tens of thousands of people, and it's going to be hard to imagine how these places recover so quickly. They will, and we will get to the other side of this. There's no doubt that we will. It's just going to be a very difficult journey. The period that I think of in relation to this is the period in the United Kingdom after World War I, when they had so many losses. And it was a period that I think Freud even called it a mourning and melancholia. And I think we're going to see that in parts of the globe. And part of it will be loss of work as well.
Yeah, and echoing to what you just said about being a long process, Sheila is actually asking how we can best support them. So basically, she is asking, how can we help deepen connections to support those feeling isolated with onset of physical distancing?
I think our counseling work makes a big difference. And the work, I'm sure most of you are doing this on Zoom or other platforms. I think the counseling work is helpful. If there's one of the things I've done with unemployed clients is I've asked them to come in with a list of people that they know. It may sound like a trivial request, but it's a way to, first of all, help them do networking. But the way I would do this now is have it serve the function of helping people to think about who they can connect with. In that list, are there people you haven't talked to in a while? And I know, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this during this crisis. We've heard from people we haven't heard from much lately. I've done more Zoom social interactions than I've ever done before. So I think there's ways for us to be more assertive and more intentional about having people deepen their connections. And I would worry, you know, in doing that, you also do develop a more explicit job network. But I think that isolation is a very important problem, and career practitioners do need to address it. Even if we're not trained, I know a lot of career practitioners aren't trained to do mental health work. You could still do a little bit of work in helping people to enhance their connections and their relationship and their relational support.
Thank you, David. Thanks. I'm combining few questions because I feel that there is a theme. Multiple people are asking, how would you or how can we apply these theories to the special needs population, such as those with disabilities?
It's a great question. I've written a little bit about disability in my books and articles. I think the communities where communities of disabled folks and children, this theories can be very relevant because the focus on economic constraints and marginalization is very much part of people's lives, people with disabling conditions. And I think this kind of approach of trying to look at satisfying their needs, looking at that as a kind of initial assessment in our career work, our educational work with people with disabling conditions is really important. And then looking at those three clusters of action steps could be very, very helpful. Agentic, the proactive engagement, social connections are critical, and critical consciousness as well. I mean, there's been a very strong critical consciousness movement from the disability world. In the United States, we've had some of the most important social legislation of the last 40 years from the disability community in the Americans for Disabilities Act. It's a model to me of activism of a community that has been marginalized.
Thank you, David. Just the last question before to wrap up. Are you aware, Marilyn is asking, are you aware of initiatives or organizations applying your theory either in US or Canada?
I am aware of people applying the practice part of it in their work. I have colleagues I know who work in one-stop career centers here. I've done trainings for them in our local Boston one-stop career center. I have colleagues who I've done trainings for career practitioners throughout the country. Are there organizations that have adopted it lock, stop, and the whole thing? Probably not, but I think that's going to happen. I think people are going to need interventions that deal with the fundamental needs that people face. So, and I'm happy to consider doing trainings for people who want to have communities and organizations adopt this. I am also developing a psychology of working informed unemployment treatment that I'm going to work on this summer. I have a number of colleagues working on this, and we're developing a multiple session workshop that we'll probably have ready to roll by the end of the summer. So if people are interested in that, you have my email address. We'll be looking for places to field test this, and I could perhaps do training of career staffs, career counseling staffs, and career coaches to deliver this workshop.
Thank you, David. I'm sure people will love to hear more about that. So yeah, I encourage you to reach out to David on that. Okay, that was the last question for today. Thank you all for your great questions and great engagement. That was terrific once again. David, thank you for your presentation today. I feel that your theories and presentation could not have been more relevant than right now. So I'm sure we all appreciate to learn more on the PWT theories and its application on our practice. So thank you for having shared your knowledge and expertise with us today.
Thank you, Sorel. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you all from CEREC. And thank you all for coming to join me on this day. And I wish you all good health and stay safe. And we do need to stay safe because we have a calling. Each of us has a calling really to serve the people who will need our help the most, and there's going to be thousands of them. So I wish you all the best, and you can reach out to me through email and through Twitter as well.
Thank you, David. Much appreciated. And
Okay.
before leaving for you all, let me share a few information. If you wish, you can learn more about the Career Theories and Model at Work book, including how you can get your own copy at cerec.ca/series. And as I mentioned earlier, you can expect to receive a follow-up email from us next week with the recording of today's webinars. In the meantime, you can still register and join us for our 30 minutes follow-up conversation next Thursdays with Tanis Goddard, where we will address questions regarding remote services for career development professionals. This conversation follows the free webinar we just did with Tanis yesterday. You can access this recording as well as those from all of our past free webinars via our cerec.ca/webinars page. Also, if you do speak French and want to learn more about online career development practice, you may want to join us for a free webinar presented by Michel Turcotte next Tuesday, May 5th, who will be presenting his work and research on remote services. Please visit our website at cerec.ca/webinars for more information or to register. And please don't forget to subscribe to our webinar news to stay informed on new webinar opportunities that we will communicate in the next few days. But for now, please take a few minutes to share your feedback and learning need with us on the survey that will pop up on your screen momentarily. And let me close by thanking you once again, David, for your presentation today, and thanking you, the participant, for your great engagement throughout the series. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you at another learning opportunity very soon.